Catholic Education Sandhurst acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
As the Church welcomes Pope Leo XIV, we pause to reflect on the extraordinary life and legacy of Pope Francis. In this special episode of Catholic Education Matters, host Kate Fogarty sits down with Bishop Shane Mackinlay to mark the passing of Pope Francis and explore the impact of his papacy both globally and here in Australia. Recorded on the first day of the conclave, this conversation offers a moving and deeply personal reflection on the Pope, who brought the peripheries to the centre, challenged systems with symbolic acts, and led with joy, mercy and humility. In this episode, we explore the global mood surrounding the conclave and its liturgical significance, Bishop Shane's personal experiences with Pope Francis at the Synod and in smaller gatherings, Pope Francis's call to synodality, solidarity and care for our common home, and what kind of leadership the Church might need next, and how Pope Francis's legacy has reshaped the path forward. This conversation offers insight into one of the most influential global figures of our time, and how his vision continues to shape our Church and our world. So let's take a moment to reflect and honour a Pope who walked with the world.
Well, welcome along, everyone. Great to have you with us. My name's Kate Fogarty. I'm the Executive Director of Catholic Education Sandhurst, and I'm really excited today. We've got Bishop Shane Mackinlay, the bishop here for us in Sandhurst, but known to many of you because he is a preeminent voice in the church in Australia and certainly has had some wonderful experiences throughout his life that we might delve into a little bit today. But really what we're here to talk about is, of course, the passing of Pope Francis and the legacy of such a wonderful Pope. Bishop Shane, welcome along.
Thank you, Kate, and really good to be here. I've been delighted to see this podcast begin, and I've enjoyed the first couple of episodes in it, so I'm very glad to be able to contribute to it.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. And you've been up at the Bishops' Conference in Sydney for the last few days, the last week or so. I imagine the conclave's the talk of the town. Would that be fair amongst the bishops?
Yeah, it's both looking forwards and looking backwards, Kate. We've been up here for a bit over a week. We finished our formal proceedings last night, and today people are heading, well, most of them are in fact heading up to Armidale, where a new bishop will be ordained for the Armidale diocese this evening, but people heading in other directions as well. And both the mood but also the formal structures of that we were engaged in shifted over the week. We were very mindful that most of our week and the liturgies and the prayer coincided with the official 9 days of mourning. And so while many of our prayers and reflections had engaged with Pope Francis and his legacy, we had a formal mass to remember him, to pray for him, to give thanks for him on Tuesday. It's Thursday today. And then, as with the shift liturgically in Rome, we moved yesterday at our final Mass to a formal Mass praying for the conclave. There's a Mass given at the end of the Missal, praying for the election of a new Pope. And many of our parishes, I would anticipate over this week, will have moved from the Masses praying at the time of the death of a Pope to that time of prayer for a new Pope. And in fact, our Mass last night began about half an hour before the official Mass in Rome that all the cardinals were participating in before they entered the conclave in the afternoon, their time. So this morning was fascinating to wake up and think, oh, we're in quite a different space, because the lead story was black smoke, which didn't surprise anybody at all. But it's clearly we're into that time of expectation, anticipation. One of the things I did earlier today was to have a look back at the coverage of what happened for us overnight of the cardinals going into the Sistine Chapel, a very solemn and liturgical. It's one of the really important things for us to remember is that this is it's an election, but it is a liturgical event. So they're all vested liturgically in their choir dress. They pray. They're led into the chapel by the choir of the Sistine Chapel, praying the Litany of the Saints, and they then make each of them individually makes an oath of secrecy and honesty about the thing. And that was quite moving for me too, because at this stage I'm in the fortunate position, having participated in the Synod over the last couple of years, of knowing many of these men personally. And so seeing them and thinking, oh, this is really very real for them and very human too. So it is liturgical, it's prayerful. They won't say much while they're in the Sistine Chapel. They'll talk a lot in the meals and so on outside that. But in the Sistine Chapel, it's a very formal thing where there's prayer and then each one of them goes forward and there's a formula as they place their vote. And then the votes are individually read out and tallied and announced. But there's not conversation or speeches as such. They've done all of that over the last week and a half and they've moved into a different mode now.
I mean, there's some great blessings to being on the other side of the world at times like these, but it's also a double-edged sword, isn't it? Knowing for the next few days, as we get up in the morning, it'll be, was there white smoke overnight? Yeah. It likely won't happen in our daylight hours, so we'll see how we go.
And one of the other things actually worth having a look at, if people have got a time to have a look, that they celebrated their time yesterday evening for us, was presided over by the Dean of the College of Cardinals, Cardinal Ray, the same as Pope Francis's funeral. And again, it was extraordinary. Now, this man is 91 years old, so he's not in the conclave himself. So he's somewhat removed from the immediacy of the vote, but his reflection on Pope Francis in his homily at the funeral, and then his reflection yesterday about the role of the Pope and the needs of the Church and the world, I thought was really very inspiring, very moving.
I think you're right. One of the big insights that a lot of us had from Pope Francis's funeral was watching the Cardinal and thinking, just as you say, in his early 90s, down onto his knees to lay the Book of the Gospels on the coffin, gave that beautiful homily, looked at his notes but didn't read directly from his notes, and held that whole very challenging liturgy together in such a public way with such dignity and a beautiful prayerfulness. Gosh, if I'm doing that at early 90s, we'll all be partying, won't we, if we're the same way?
Look, if you do that at any point in your life, I think it's an extraordinary contribution. So we can be very grateful for that. And it was certainly fitting and appropriate and wonderful to be able to be part of that sort of celebration. The shape of so much reflected and was guided by Pope Francis himself, his instructions, but his personality, his contribution, the great bond that people have with him. One of the things people have said over the years is people used to come to see Pope John Paul. He was really the first Pope of the grand spectacle and the world tours and so on. They came to listen to Benedict, such an erudite, reflective man, and you really did have to listen and think carefully. They came to be with Francis. And that would be one of my reflections, having met him a number of times now, both in smaller groups, but also at the Synod. He was very personally engaged in the Synod, the 2 months of that, last year and the year before that I spent in Rome. And how we experienced him in those meetings is just what you saw on the public stage. It was that same personal, direct, inspiring, humorous, very engaged, very personal presence. He would really come to life when there were people there, and he worked very hard. I could see this, a bit behind the scenes. He would work very hard to make sure that he had time to be in the room for people to come and speak with him. Terrible things people did to him, not just sign my book, but Pope Francis, we've got an anniversary coming up in our parish. Could you record a message for them on our phone right now? And he would, and did it beautifully, very generous.
So do you want to just talk to a little bit about that? You met him personally a couple of times, but you also were in the room with him at the Synod over a number of weeks. I've heard you say elsewhere some of that about his striking ability to be so present and to come alive when he's in front of a crowd. From a very personal level, and you don't need to share everything, obviously, but what were your impressions of being really up close with him?
So one of the things I saw and experienced and saw and heard other people talk about too is he really and increasingly over the course of his pontificate, he reshaped the way that meetings with him happened. So the traditional way, for instance, that a group of bishops would meet with the Pope was that they would come in and one of them would give a prepared speech, and then he would give a prepared speech back, and then there'd be photos and everyone would go home. And that was nice. There was something worthwhile about that. He increasingly would reduce the time of the prepared speech and then say, all right, let's have a chat. What do you want to say? What do you want to ask? And by the time of the first time that I would have met him 3 years ago, he was putting the prepared speeches aside entirely. He didn't even get them to prepare them and give them to you on paper. He would devote all the time and a lot of time, a bigger time generally than was scheduled. And he really listened. He not just gave time for people to say what they wanted, he listened very intently, and he would respond with an honest answer, with something where you went away with something more to think about and reflect on. You learnt something, often with humour and often inspired and encouraged. It was really wonderful to see, and the energy that he gave to that, and clearly that he drew from that also. These were the times you would see him most energised. And extraordinary too, when you think, well, by the time I first met him, he was 85. He was 76 when he was elected. He had put in his resignation and was waiting for it to be accepted, and then was elected to this extra position after he'd already had a very full life and served not just a few years and not just keeping the seat warm, served for 12 years in a way that shifted the direction of the church, of the papacy, had a profound influence on the world generally. And I think more as he went, partly because he would always have done that as people came to hear and reflect on those extraordinary and extraordinarily inspired documents like Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti that we might talk about later, on the environment, on the care for creation, and on broader human solidarity. But also because over the period of his pontificate, I think we've seen a reduction in the type of presence of genuinely global and inspiring leaders around the world. And so he's more and more been very much someone who people have looked to, which they would have always, but even more so when there's not many other people to look to.
Yeah, I think, and he certainly had a gift for finding the moment, didn't he? I know when just after his passing, I asked a number of staff, send me through some photos of the moments that capture best for you who Francis was. And it was striking how many images became front of mind for people because of the symbolic act that was occurring in the given moment. I'm wondering, do you have any of those images, whether it's, a photo or a bit of footage or whatever it might be, but those, 2 or 3 things that you think that for me, that was either a seminal moment or it's the moment for you that captures who Francis was and what his pontificate was?
I think you're right to point to this. He was the master of powerful symbolic gestures, which we will carry with us as enormously influential. The very thing of him appearing on the balcony, dressed simply, rather than with all the elaborate robes that had been laid out for him, dressed simply in the white soutane of the Pope. And then hearing that he had chosen the name Francis, extraordinary, Francis of Assisi. Nobody has dared to choose that, not because he's not inspiring as a saint, but because that sets the expectations so high in terms of simplicity, commitment, generosity, commitment to the poor. And Francis lived up to all of that. So that very appearance and the way that he engaged with the crowd, asking them to pray for him, speaking of coming from the ends of the earth, and has really been faithful to that, bringing the ends of the earth to the centre, speaking for the voiceless and giving them a place. And then very shortly after that, visiting Lampedusa, that island where so many refugees and asylum seekers around there coming to Europe had suffered so much, and many of them losing their lives. And then on Holy Thursday, just a few weeks after he was made Pope, there was still at the time where the rules said that on Holy Thursday night, what happened as part of the washing of the feet is the 12 men had their feet washed by the priest. Well, he said, "Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to one of the basilicas either. I'm going to a prison, and I'm going to wash the feet of the people who are there, men and women, Christians, non-Christians, because my response is to the people and the rules need to follow that." And so eventually those rules were formally changed. But that was true, I think, for so much of what he did was he was deeply rooted in the tradition and the doctrine of the church, but he would take that always as a starting point rather than an ending point. That and the person in front of him and the situation in front of him. How can I draw on that to respond to the needs of this person, this situation? And he did that with wonderful authenticity, generosity, and commitment, and would then come back to say, and if we need to reframe or adjust the doctrine, well, that's what we do. He certainly wasn't into throwing things out the window, but he wasn't ever prepared to take them as the last word.
I'm sure as you were talking there, a lot of our listeners are thinking through a number of the images that they remember fondly or that challenged them when they saw those images for the first time. And there certainly were a number of those as well. How about, you spoke about those two encyclicals. Were there any other writings or times where Francis spoke that for you, we're 2 or 3 weeks past his death? Are there particular words of his written or spoken that are resonating with you a little bit differently at the moment or are particularly important to you?
Certainly, that description of the church as a field hospital, I think, is one of the things that I've heard lots of people return to, and that really resonates for me too. It's a guiding thing in terms of our starting point. Yes, we are committed to proclaiming the gospel, affirming the truth of what's been revealed in Jesus, and that we have articulated in various ways through our tradition. But we do that in the context of meeting the needs of the people around us.
Can I jump in there, Bishop Shane? Because I've been thinking about this one a lot too, and I'm wondering why it is one of the things that you just keep hearing people reference, always have done so, but even more so in the last couple of weeks. And I've been wondering if it's because we've often thought of the Catholic Church as a broad tent, and that it's a space for all people. And in our lives today, when we spend time in tents, sometimes it's for camping, but really probably for most of us, it's for celebratory events. That's actually the time we enter tents the most, whether it's a party or a concert or a circus or whatever it might be. But this reminded us of when a tent becomes truly powerfully useful to a community and to a people and to a person. And I think that we'd kind of lost that element of the symbolism, and he just, in one sentence, took us to the heart of the matter of who we are and allowed us to keep that beautiful imagery, which is biblical, of the tent, and carry that forward into a doing, into an action that was meaningful for so many people.
I think that's right. It is deeply a part of our tradition, but it was a long way from the first thing you would think about when you thought about the Pope. You think about the Pope and you think about the grandeur of St. Peter's. He never said, there's no place for that. But he said, we need to remember that our job is that of the field hospital, is that of the tent, that simple tent, and locating himself there, not having been promoted up above that, but being very much in the midst of that.
Are there other words or writings that are particularly important to you or have come to light again for you in some mysterious way over the last few weeks?
Not so much over the last few weeks, but certainly those two encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, and then that other wonderful document, Evangelii Gaudium, where he reflects on really the whole, or so many aspects of the life of the church in parishes, for priests, for bishops, for married people, and frames it all in the context of joy. And says, if we're not joyful and if we're not helping other people, the people around us come to experience and live out of that joy, we're missing the boat. That's what our core job is.
That's been the two words I've heard in regard to his writings: joy and mercy. You know, that they sit seemingly in juxtaposition, but actually absolutely integrally entwined in human life and in our calling in life. So let's take a moment just to reflect on the actual passing of Pope Francis and the funeral. I'm wondering, again, 2 or 3 weeks past then, are there images or moments that stand out to you from that time already, and things that you think perhaps the symbolism of a moment has more value for us than we might have anticipated in the moment, or ones that you've heard a lot of people reflect on?
Couple of things there. One is really the extraordinary juxtaposition of the day before he died, his determination. I mean, one of the other things he was very stubborn, very determined, and his doctors had told him go home and spend 2 months resting. Well, he wasn't going to do that. That was never going to work. So the determination to be out in the square in St Peter's on Easter Sunday morning, and then only 6 days later back at that same place for his funeral. So that juxtaposition and how dramatic and pronounced that made the experience of what he gave on Easter Sunday, I think. Then, in lots of ways, the funeral was, and this has become more so over recent popes, but it was more so again with Francis. It was on a bigger scale, but anyone who's been to a Catholic funeral would have recognised exactly what was going on. We don't all get the Greek choir at the end, which was extraordinary. But broadly, the dynamic of his funeral was the same as any one of the faithful, which matches so much what he kept saying, that the starting point for all of us is we are baptised. We are baptised as missionary disciples, and that was the first thing for him and the most important thing for him. Everything else had to fit around that. So I think precisely that there weren't things that were unusual symbols for us. And then a consequences of him choosing to be buried in St Mary Major rather than in St Peter's was that wonderful procession through the streets, the chance for the people who were gathered to have a last opportunity up close to farewell him in not a grand hearse or anything like that. The Pope would be with his chair taken out and his coffin put in. I mean, it just fitted him so perfectly.
I'm still very struck by the photo of the shoes that he was buried in. For those who didn't get a chance to see that, he was buried in a pair of, obviously, his everyday shoes. They were scuffed, they were grotty, and they were well worn around the toe, and you couldn't see the heel, but well worn shoes. And I was thinking, perhaps he gave the direction that was what he was to be buried in, and carry through that sense of who he was and his personal integrity right to the end. But equally so, somebody made the choice still to bury him in those shoes. And it seems to me it's one of the last decisions we make for people we love is what clothes that they're going to be buried in. They might issue some instructions, but very often families feel a little bit different about that and change those options, to be something that's meaningful to the living as much as to the person who's passed away. And I sense that happened here, that, probably he did say, leave me in whatever clothes I got out of the day before. But equally, people respected that and recognised it would have been so tempting, I think, to put him in some nice shiny shoes, knowing that there were going to be 40 million photos of him in that coffin, and they didn't. And, that speaks volumes to the people who were around him at that time, and the love and the respect they had and the deep knowledge they had of the person he was, and wanting that legacy, his legacy, to be clear right down to that very last thing. Yeah, I thought very powerful.
A little thing like that speaks volumes in the way that you've spoken about in terms of what did happen, but also in terms of the alternative. From day one, they had the ceremonial red slippers there ready for him, and I'm sure they were still there on the last day. It would have been very tempting to pop them on, and that would have said a whole lot of different things.
I've noticed there's been a lot of stories in the media the last few days about the person, the company, the little family company that prepares the clothes for the Pope's investiture.
Mancinelli.
Yes, and I wonder if he's been feeling like, oh, finally, I've got my moment in the sun after so many years of being ignored and not being able to do my lovely fancy gear. I just had a little wondering about him. You might know the answer to this. I've been trying to find out, and I haven't found footage of previous funerals. Is it normal for the Pope's coffin to be placed on the ground in St. Peter's Square?
I remember that certainly for John Paul and for Benedict. What was different was when he was lying in state, his coffin was also on the ground, tilted a little bit for visibility, but it was on the floor of the basilica, and he was in the coffin. Previously, that period of lying in state would have been on a catafalque and not yet in a coffin, so with the body open on a catafalque. And he was very clear,
Simple coffin.
simple in a coffin and on the floor of the basilica.
Yeah. Again, really going to the humanity of life, isn't it? Not covering over that. This is a human
Let's
gone
not
home to
pretend
God.
it's something that it's not.
Yeah, tremendous. So, Bishop Shane, when you think then, I mean, again, we're only a few weeks out and we're in the middle of conclave and all of the rest, but there are things starting to emerge as the truly outstanding legacy points of Francis's pontificate. I'm wondering for you, what's front of mind for you there in terms of what would you hope the people of Australia, the people of Sandhurst, what do you think for us is the legacy of Pope Francis's time of service to our church?
So I'd probably pick four things. The first is what he said on that first night on the balcony, coming from the ends of the earth and putting that in the middle. And the way that he's done that again and again in his writings, in his gestures, in where he has gone, in his travels, in the cardinals that he's named, being that voice for the peripheries and saying that we need to begin from the peripheries. As Christians, our centre is the edge. Second thing would be that call to listen to the cry of the earth and realise that the cry of the earth is one that we hear reflected in and tightly related to the cry of the poor. So the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, that responsibility to care for our common home. And that's certainly, going back to one of the things I said earlier, that's one of the things where he's become more and more of a voice that doesn't have the broader support of world leadership that there would have been even a decade ago. Then the third thing would be the theme of Fratelli Tutti, that idea of solidarity in a world that is so much polarised and increasingly polarised, fractious, thinking about turning inward on the needs that we have in our part of the world, the needs we have in our country, in our immediate community, even within our communities. It's one of the things I think post-COVID that we're still trying to reckon with, and I'm not sure that we'll recover from, is there was a whole turning in and withdrawing from broader engagement. So that call to recognise that we're only truly and fully human in our relatedness with one another. So that idea of solidarity, fratelli tutti, brothers and sisters, all of us, which is so different from the dynamic of so much of what else is happening in our world. And then the fourth thing really is what that looks like alongside the centrality of baptism in our church context. And that's where synodality comes in, that elaborate word for describing that what we're on about as followers of Jesus is walking together. We can only be a follower of Jesus as part of the body of Christ, starting from people who have a common baptism and who are called together to carry forward Jesus' mission, and who each have a unique responsibility and privilege to contribute not just to the works of the church, but also to guiding and shaping and decision making in the church. So there's responsibility as well as tasks and how that's carried out. So that's something that we're still learning, and which of course in the context of a world which thrives on, and you get more clicks the more fights you have, the more adversarial it is. We've just been through an election campaign nationally, and we've seen so much of that highlighted, the adversarial, the fighting, the pitting against one another. To be called as church, both to be faithful to who we are as church, but also to be a model for the world, or a prophetic model of a different way of engaging humanly, which is built on encounter and dialogue between people rather than a dispute between positions, and that seeks to build up a sense of our responsibility and our participation together in something that we can only build and be part of together.
I mean, what a legacy. Each of those 4 points speak not just to those of the Catholic Church, but to people of God more broadly, and the general population more broadly. It speaks to those in leadership roles. It speaks to those seeking to live a good life, where we're working for the common good is the priority. So there are few people, as you say, few leaders who can assuredly say they've left a legacy that is so broad in content and yet so particularized to the hearts and the minds of individuals right around the world. It really is an extraordinary legacy, and I'm sure even as time goes by over the coming days, weeks, months, and even years, there will be a refining of that and a deeper understanding of what an incredible way of living he has left us, and aspirational and yet deeply affirming as well.
And that certainly has been part of the mood for us bishops here this week in Sydney, is that so much of what he has begun in our church and locally in our experience of church and the various initiatives that have been taken, but more significantly, things that are ongoing, but that we're doing differently because of what he's called us to. You can't go back from that. Inevitably and helpfully, this will be adjusted, this will be refined, we'll get further developments. But the foundation that Francis has contributed is one that we're deeply immersed in, and that we can't imagine not carrying forward.
Now, we've all watched Conclave, the movie, and we've all got a new awareness of the degree of politicking that can happen whilst leaving space open for the Holy Spirit to do its work in and amongst them in that moment of voting. And I don't expect a name from you. That would be completely unfair. But what's your own personal curiosity and excitement about it? And what have you enjoyed? The media's all over this, the secular media as well as the religious media. What have you enjoyed about, each conclave we have gets a little more public in terms of how much the media has access to the cardinals before they go in and, all of the rest. What's giving you a buzz?
I mean, it struck me again, the spectacle and the drama and the symbolism of it all is astonishing. Everything from the votes being cast in front of Michelangelo's Last Judgment to the smoke coming out of the chimney. I mean, what a primitive
Performance.
visceral way of announcing a result. I mean, and yet so effective, like it captures our imagination. So yes, it is political, but in a different sense. So politics really is just a way of describing how we set up and negotiate the structures of our relating together. And politics can be done in a whole lot of different ways. So yes, it is political. It's not going to have been political. I mean, I've met probably half of the cardinal-electors. There were 60 of them in the who were members of the synod, so that's nearly half of them. And the way I would expect the way they engaged there to be the way they engage here, and the way that I experienced at the synod and in our own plenary council and so on, where there's certainly passionate and very deeply held views put forward, but in a way that is also about listening. It's not politicking for a particular outcome or a particular candidate. There won't have been that, but there will have been listening to what's emerging here and who could we look to here who might be best positioned to carry that forward. And looking at them, I think informed observers seem to be landing on about a dozen, and they're people who I think one way or another could do that. They do it each in a different way, with different nuances, but each of them would bring tremendous gifts and experience and contribute that in their own way. And it's important too to remember, and this is something that's moved, I think, over the last 2.5 weeks since Francis died. Initially, the conversation was all, who will be Francis's successor? But more and more people have started to say, oh, we need to remember, while we give thanks for and celebrate the legacy that Francis has given us and the extraordinary contribution he's made, the cardinals are not choosing a successor of Pope Francis. The cardinals are choosing the 267th successor of St. Peter. And they will be very mindful of that. It'll be a very prayerful, very reflective, lots of conversation about, I'm sure, about as names start. So the first ballot would only have raised names. And some of those and the numbers they got were probably surprising. And so there'll be, it's no accident they only have one ballot on the first day, because it's really saying, what are we looking at here? And then they'll go and there'll certainly be conversation about what they've seen, about what they appreciate about particular people, about the conversations that they've had over the last 2 weeks, the formal and the informal ones. What are they looking for? What concerns them? What are their hopes? And one of the extraordinary things, of course, is that this requires a 2/3 majority. That's not easy. You've got to have a lot of people, and it's not. I mean, technically, they can vote for anyone. Practically, they'll vote for someone who's in the room, and there's probably a range of people who, for one reason or another, are too old or too young or too whatever. So it's actually a smaller group of live candidates, but it's not like, say, the elections we've just had in Australia, where really in most of our seats and nationally there were two options. You've got at least a dozen, if not 20 candidates who are like. I would be surprised if there were less than 20 candidates who got votes in the first ballot, and probably more.
If you were in the room, Bishop Shane, just as in how you're feeling at the moment, what sort of a leadership, what sort of an agenda do you think you'd like to see in the successor?
So it's not just an agenda. Agenda matters in terms of what things matter to them, how would they carry things forward. The person matters in terms of, this person needs to be able to carry enormous public occasions and meetings with world leaders and leadership of the church, of that enormous administrative exercise of leading the church. And also, this needs to be someone who can inspire. So someone who is deeply prayerful, deeply spiritual, and who can inspire and lead us in proclaiming the gospel, lead us into encountering the joy of the gospel that Francis spoke of. So that spiritual, inspiring dimension, the capacity for leadership as we'd understand it more generally, and then a deep appreciation of Francis's contribution across those 4 areas I spoke about before, but not being intimidated and daunted by that and thinking, well, I just need to repeat what Francis did. Whoever is elected needs to be able to value that, build on it, but take it forward in their own way and make their own contribution. It's enormously challenging, but very exciting. And it's the sort of thing, as so many of our leadership positions, can only happen because of the presence of the Holy Spirit across the church, animating us, leading us, guiding us, inspiring us.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, we might leave it there, given we're now right in the middle of the conclave, and perhaps we'll come back down the track and have a chat about who is the inspired vote of the cardinals through the work of the Holy Spirit to lead us into the future at some point down the track. But I want to thank you, Bishop Shane, for your time today, for your honesty, for your sharing of your personal experiences, but also challenging us to think a little bit more deeply about what this legacy is of Pope Francis and how it in fact sets a bedrock for what is to come next, both challenging and inspiring us to live our our faith, to live our responsibility to the gospel in new and exciting ways. So thank you, and we'll look forward to another conversation down the track.
Very happy to be part of it today, Kate, and into the future. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Catholic Education Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who's passionate about learning, leadership and community. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we explore what truly matters in education.